June 2016, when in your mid-20s and employed as a neonatal nurse in the Countess of Chester Hospital in with specialist training in intensive care, murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder 6 others. In the case of one of them, dying on separate occasions 2 weeks apart to murder her. You are now to be sentenced for your crimes. Statutory surcharge in the... You acted in a way that was completely contrary to the normal human instincts of nature and caring for babies, in gross breach of all citizens place in those who work in the medical and caring professions. Those you harmed were born prematurely, and some were at risk of not surviving. But in each case, you deliberately harmed them. You said that having a baby is everything that being a nurse is, as indeed it should be. You also best to care for them. That was but one. You were found to There is no doubt diligent, outwardly, were a conscientious time. You prided yourself in your competence. Nurses spoke very your 2012 tour to student nurses, and in the spring of 2015, the intensive. You relish intensive care nursery. Your messages to colleagues that were on or who had uncommon medical and into the events of the babies, which commenced in 2018 in your actions. You specifically targeted twins, triplets. Some babies were healthy, others had medical issues of which you were aware. The majority of your victims suffered acute pain as a result of what you did to them. They all fought. Some, sadly, struggled in vain and died. You used a number of different ways to try to kill them, thereby misleading clinicians into believing the collapses had or might have had a natural cause or were a consequence of a developing medical condition. You took opportunities to harm babies when staff were in breaks or away from babies. On some occasions, you falsified records to indicate there were signs of a deterioration before a collapse occurred. You knew that the last thing anyone working in the unit would or did think was that someone caring for the babies was deliberately harming them. As the number of unexpected and unexplained collapses and deaths escalated, senior doctors started to think the unthinkable and consider the possibility that someone was, in fact, deliberately harming the babies, and you were identified as the common factor. You had a detached enthusiasm for the resuscitations and what followed. You endeavoured to impress colleagues and clinicians and sought reassurance from them as to your competence and skills, and would message others to the effect that no one was at fault. On occasions, you cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in the immediate aftermath of a death. When the homes of both you and your parents were searched, confidential documents relating to babies, including handover and resuscitation sheets and notes and blood gas readings, were found, and there were entries in a diary recording relevant events. Handover sheets relating to all but the first 4 of the babies had been taken from the unit and kept by you. I am satisfied you started to keep these documents after those initial offences in June 2015 as morbid records of the dreadful events surrounding the collapses of your victims and what you had done to them. You had a fascination with the babies and their families, which extended to making repeated searches on Facebook for their parents, sometimes immediately following the events, and on occasions much later. A piece of paper with dent writing on both sides, setting out your thoughts and feelings, was found in the first search of your home in 2018. Amongst the phrases you wrote were, "The world is better off without me," and "I am evil, I did this." The impact of your crimes has been immense, as disclosed by the deeply moving personal statements that have been read to the court this morning. The lives of newborn or relatively newborn babies were ended almost as soon as they began, and lifelong harm has been caused, all in horrific circumstances. Loving parents have been robbed of their cherished children, and others have to live with the physical and mental consequences of your actions. Siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters. You have caused deep psychological trauma, brought enduring grief and feelings of guilt, caused strains in relationships and disruption to the lives of all the families of all your victims. It is no part of my function to reach conclusions as to the underlying reason or reasons for your actions, nor could I, for they are known only to you. I must pass appropriate sentences according to law, addressing the seriousness of your offences, the facts of which I now describe briefly. In common with all nurses, you knew from your training the dangers caused by air getting into the venous system, and that air embolus was very rarely encountered in clinical practice. He had a lung infection which was being treated by antibiotics. However, his breathing stabilized. He was being fed by a nasogastric tube. You messaged a colleague saying you needed to throw yourself back in and take an ITU baby soon. On that night shift of the 13th, 14th of June, you were the designated nurse for 2 babies of care nursery. You will have been aware that she was being treated for an infection and were the designated nurse for 2 other babies in that nursery on that night shift. You decided to kill her and administered air into her intravenously, causing her to die from air embolus. You were involved in her resuscitation, and bleeding started earlier in the shift and was seen by his mother. She was very concerned, and you sought to reassure her. The circumstances of the attempted resuscitation and his death were harrowing. with profuse bleeding. At the time, the clinicians thought he may have died of necrotizing enterocolitis, and no post-mortem was undertaken. You commented in messages to colleagues that he had a massive hemorrhage, and it could have happened to anyone. On the following night shift, the 4th to 5th of insulin needed to be added to the half-litre bags of feed. It was not noticeable in the bag, nor would it be apparent that any was missing from the insulin bottle. No doubt you were reassured that no one suspected that insulin had been added, and with this knowledge you went on to repeat this method of attempt. Although on the margin of survival, she did survive. By the 13th of August, she was stable and was transferred to the Countess of Chester, where the general trend of improvement continued. The 7th of September was her 100th day of life. Nurses had planned a small celebration, including the display of a banner. On the night shift of the 6th to 7th, you deliberately her heart rate and saturation levels dropped, and she required breathing assistance. You were nearby and assisted, later sought to blame a colleague for potentially overfeeding. She requires constant nursing care and attention, and will require surgery and support throughout her life. Just over a month later, on the 20th, she suffered a series of sudden, unexpected, and unexplained episodes. On the 30th of September, you infused a large quantity of air down her nasogastric tube into her stomach and bowel, thereby interfering with her breathing, reducing her oxygen saturations and heart rate, and causing her to vomit and require oxygen under pressure. It is also likely that in the early hours of the 13th of October, you infused air into her venous system. The following night, she collapsed again, but recovered with breathing support and was transferred to Arrow Park for 2 days. 6 days after her return, on the night of the 22nd to 23rd of October, she suffered her final collapse, crying out in severe pain as a result of air embolus after you had injected air into her venous system. She too died in her parents' arms. You were communicating with colleagues about the triplets and said you felt most at home in the intensive care nursery. On your first day back at work, on the 23rd of June, the horror of the consequences of your actions and the desperate attempts to resuscitate him and save his life, sadly to no avail, were vividly described by clinicians and his father. The following day, and he collapsed. His life could not be saved. His father remembered him struggling the cruelty and calculation of your actions were truly horrific. After these last collapses and deaths, you were suspended from nursing duties, but pursued complaints of being treated unfairly. When your home was later searched, as well as your 2016 diary, which contained references to long days on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of June, and to J, E and M, respectively, there were handover sheets over that period with resuscitation notes written on the back. All, I have no doubt, being records that you kept to remind you of the details of the consequences of what you had done to those children. For the offence of murder, the sentence is fixed by law and is imprisonment for life. You are now 33 years of age and were over 21 when you committed the offences. Pursuant to the relevant prevailing statutory regime, by having regard to Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act 2003, I have to determine whether the seriousness of the offences of murder, individually or in combination, is so exceptionally high that I should not make a minimum term order and you should spend the rest of your life in prison. For offences of attempted murder, whole life sentences of imprisonment are reserved for wholly exceptional cases. Over a period of just under 13 months, you killed 7 fragile babies and attempted to kill 6 others. Some of your victims were only a day or a few days old. All were extremely vulnerable. They were in a hospital where others were striving to provide them with dedicated medical and nursing care. By their nature and number, such murders and attempted murders by a neonatal nurse entrusted to care for them are offences of very exceptional seriousness. The damaging impact of your actions on others working at that hospital, including those who numbered you as a friend, betraying their trust and creating upset and suspicion, as well as eroding confidence in clinicians and nurses generally, aggravates their seriousness. This was a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.